No worries. So this panel will be moderated by Professor Jakob Feinig. He needs no introduction, but for those who don't know, this is an assistant professor at Valeonti University. His sociological work is focused on the historically changing politics of money creation in British colonial America and the United States. He is the author of Moral Economics of Money, which if you have not yet read, I recommend you do. So it's really hard to think of a better person to moderate this panel today. Without further ado, over to you, Mr. Feinig.
Thank you so much. We're going to go chronologically, and our first panelist is Katie Moore, who is an assistant professor of history at UC Santa Barbara. She's a historian of early American political economy and the Atlantic world, specializing in money, debt, and finance. Her PhD is from Boston University, and she has a book under contract with the University of Chicago Press. It's entitled Promise to Pay: The Politics and Power of Money in Early America.
Stand by. Yes. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you all for being here today. So today I'd like to talk to you about America's first paper money, the bills of credit of Britain's North American colonies between 1690 and 1775. Now, for a long time, historians paid relatively little attention to money in early America, with some important exceptions, of course. But in the past few decades, studies of American capitalism and the English financial revolution, studies that approach money and markets as politically constituted, have helped to change that. More recently, the 2008 Wall Street bailout, COVID-19 relief, and military spending in the US have cast a spotlight on how, for whom, and under what conditions states make money. This has prompted scholars to reconsider the government-issued paper currencies of colonial North America, informed by anthropologists, sociologists, legal scholars. Recent historians have found early American money to be a powerful policy tool and political weapon, a technology of imperial formation, and a cultural signifier of oppression or liberation, to quote 3 studies just from 2021. At the same time, scholars of racial capitalism have used the methods of cultural studies to interrogate the relationship between new ideas about money and value on one hand, and the creation of hierarchies of difference on the other. And economic historians have sought to debunk the classical quantity theory of money in early modern contexts, arguing that inflation was not a matter of the market, but of politics. So early Americans indeed describe the political basis of local paper currencies similarly to how heterodox economists today talk about the taxes drive money approach to modern money, evoking medieval monetary knowledge while foreshadowing chartalism and Keynesianism. Colonial leaders emphasized the relationship between the colonial state and money users. As one official wrote in 1691, in Massachusetts colony, the birthplace of America's first paper money, seen here, the credit conveyed by these bills now circulates from one hand to another until the public taxes call for it. An anonymous pamphleteer explained in 1790 that it's the promise or engagement of the government to redeem it that gives the whole value and currency to the bill. So these were akin to tax anticipation notes, a collective loan from public creditors to their fellow taxpayers, an interest-free loan that was repaid, so to speak, when the Treasury accepted the notes from colonists in value equal to money. And in the meantime, these paper promises circulated as currency. But if colonial governments played an active role in implementing America's first paper money through the fiscal process, the coercion of this process was not enough in and of itself. As we all know, money also requires the confidence of those who use it. As one merchant put it in a 1740 essay, bills of credit rested on a dual promise. the explicit promise of the government to redeem them, and an implicit promise founded in the common consent of the colonies where they passed. Colonial paper currencies depended on the reciprocal trust between local governments and money users in which public credit was grounded, and that gave these currencies their value in exchange. And I want to make sure to point out that this particular bill has been altered, in fact, from 5 shillings to 20 shillings. So printed essays and printed currencies themselves reflected paper money's fiscal basis. Archival sources reveal a more complex process at work. The account books of colonial elites suggest that once bills of credit entered circulation, monetary transactions were as much about status and class as about the trust between monetary authorities and money users. Now, certainly the signatures that marked the bills represented a world in flux, right? An early capitalist system that relied as much on personal reputation as on financial credit to establish and assess trustworthiness. Consider the account book of the Massachusetts judge, Samuel Sewall, who was a wealthy merchant and landlord. In 1691, Elizabeth Drake, a poor woman whose husband was slain in King William's War, gave Sewall a 10-shilling bill of credit to procure a load of wood for her. The wood cost 6 shillings 6 pence, and so he noted he owed her 3 shillings 6 pence. Perhaps Drake had received the bill as part of a widower's pension, and perhaps she had wondered, even worried about who would be willing to receive this new currency from her. Sewall tendered the bills as well, for all kinds of goods and services, including even land. Later that year, he paid Thomas Hale £24 for a 30-acre lot on the banks of the Merrimack. The next winter, he purchased 8 skeins of thread at 12 pence per skein from Joseph Bullard and gave him a 10-shilling bill so that he promises to bring or send me 2 more such skeins in a fortnight or 2. Now, whether Hale and Bullard accepted the bills cheerfully or out of deference to their superior is unknown. But as one of the colony's most prominent settlers, Sewall's involvement in imposing them would have been vital for cultivating monetary trust. So as relationships like these based on dependency and obligation persisted, new ones between money users and money creators arose. Wartime bureaucracies reviewed the public accounts, they drew up warrants for payment, and they brought paper money to public creditors, mostly soldiers in the beginning. Now, to be clear, local governments paid captains who clothed and fed soldiers and distributed their wages, reinforcing customary labor relationships based on reciprocity and obligation, and simultaneously cultivating trustworthiness in the money in which the wages were paid. Sewall himself worked as a commissioner of currency emissions, dispensing bills of credit or debentures, which were bonds redeemable for bills in the future, to those captains. So usually the legislation authorizing a currency emission specified the total amount, how it was to be spent, and the type and date of the taxes that would remove it from circulation. For colonial settlers, the liberty to make money, as they called it, and the authority to spend that money were constitutive of the power to tax. The authority to spend made the power to tax meaningful, since it was through spending in the first place that colonial assemblies created the money in which taxes were to be paid. The New York Paper Money Acts of 1709, that colony's first, were typical in this regard. They also laid out the protocol that soldiers returning from Canada had to follow in order to get paid, and they said how much of the money was earmarked for discharging existing debts. £216 for 17 sawyers and 13 carpenters who had served on the Canada expedition. £25 for the mayor of Albany and a colonial interpreter for going to Onondaga the previous spring. £147 for the lieutenant governor for supplying candles for the fort in New York City. But state records also indicate that individual colonists were increasingly turning to colonial assemblies to alleviate their suffering. In the middle of King William's War, an Ambrose Dawes petitioned the Massachusetts government for relief. Dawes had lost one of his eyes serving as a soldier and laborer at Pemaquid, since which he had not only been unable to go to livelihood, but had fallen into debt paying for his medical care. The Assembly voted to grant him £10 in consideration of damage sustained in their Majesty's service by the loss of one of his eyes. Entire towns often petitioned the Assembly for assistance, like Lancaster, a besieged village on the front lines. The town clerk lamented how the villagers had been, quote, so long necessitated to live in garrison where neither men nor women could do but very little towards the supply of their families. whereby many are brought to extreme poverty, not knowing how to get either food or clothing for themselves or families. Also the great charge expended in building, repairing, and maintaining so many garrisons. In answer to the clerk's plea, the Assembly voted to allocate £20 to the village out of the next tax collection. So one of the ways that early Americans made money was by making claims directly on a colonial state. In doing so, they participated directly in creating the money they circulated. Anyone could be a public creditor with the right claim, including those on the margins of colonial society. Their appeals to the authorities, while not the primary drivers of money creation, add complexity to the traditional narrative with its emphasis on the rise of the assemblies. The experience of Hugh Pike of Newbury, Massachusetts is just one example of how common soldiers had to scrounge year after year for their due. So Pike was wounded in the 1707 Port Royal expedition, and he initially received an annual pension of £5. In 1714, he claimed an additional £3, 15 shillings to pay his surgeon's bill. But Pike's health continued to decline, and every year from 1720 to 1725, he pleaded for more assistance. Like others who successfully petitioned for increases to their pensions, Pike would have known to emphasize, even if it meant embellishing, his inability to support himself and his family. And most years, he did manage to procure an additional £15. Native American veterans, too, could press for years for relief. Consider William Jeffrey of Harwich, Massachusetts, who described his condition as poor and miserable after being shot in the arm in an attack on Monhegan Island in spring of 1724. One of only 3 men to survive the attack, Jeffrey had been disabled from doing any labor to support himself. After petitioning the royal governor for relief, evidently unsuccessfully, he appealed to the Assembly, which granted him £10 plus £5 per year until 1736. 5 years after the payment stopped, Jeffrey, now being grown old, he wrote, again petitioned the Assembly for relief and was allowed a lump sum of £25. Well, you may have noticed that Jeffrey's pension payments were significantly lower than Pike's, and Native soldiers' wages were about half of those of their white counterparts. Neither man's pension was near enough what was needed to support a family. In 1730, most Massachusetts laboring men made between £35 and £60 per year local currency, today between £1,400 and £2,400 sterling, and even that was insufficient, as you might imagine, to feed, clothe, and shelter a family. It's not as if there wasn't enough money to go around. The Assembly offered generous salaries for colonial officials, spent lavishly on infrastructure, appointing colonial elites to handle money for construction projects that transformed the physical landscape. I think PowerPoint transcribed the 18th century print. That's not on my file. Sorry about that. So in New York, which was, wow, that's really interesting. Never seen that before. In New York, which was insulated to an extent from the actual fighting, war was a time of, must be a PC. War was a time of opportunity, especially for colonial women. In 1714, the Assembly passed this act addressing the demands of several persons who claimed sums of money as due to them for this colony for services formerly done, and in order to discharge the said claims, authorizing that the sum of £27,680 be by the Treasury of this colony paid to the several persons hereafter named. Of the hundreds of claimants listed in this act, many were women whose husbands had died in battle or who had themselves contributed goods and labor during the Anglo-French Wars. Grace Lucretia Hedgeman, a New York City widow, received £25 for 3 years' service and sufferings of her husband. Margaret Stokes received £26 for provisions and other things bought by herself and her late husband for the governor's trip to Albany. And widow Elizabeth Jordan received £25 for lodging soldiers and entertaining government officials in her home. The money, paid out in bills of credit, was redeemable after 21 years in payment of the liquor excise, hence the nickname, the First Long Bills. In a 1720 essay, a London writer marveled that the bills are established on a secure fund, meaning the liquor excise, and made current in all payments whatsoever, making them as worthy as any other current coin of the kingdom. It's important to note that these bills were not actually spent into circulation, but were issued to settle earlier debts of the colony created when private persons advanced goods or services for the war. In this and other cases, their issuance was a swap of one more liquid public debt for another less liquid public debt. So more research is needed on the extent to which Black individuals, free and enslaved, made claims on the public. The victualler of Castle William in Boston successfully petitioned the Massachusetts Assembly on behalf of Geoffrey York, his Black servant, for permission to enlist in the muster roll at the same pay as a white sentinel of £3 per month. In South Carolina, militia acts provided for arming enslaved men in case of an alarm and for paying them £10 at public charge for every enemy captured and killed. After the Stonewall Rebellion, dozens of enslaved people received monetary rewards for turning King's witness. Black and indigenous New Yorkers were technically entitled to the wolf bounty, £5 for each wolf killed. To claim their prize, they had to carry the head of the animal to a justice of the peace who would give them a certificate to the county treasurer who would pay the reward. But as one historian has noted of the dispersal of wolf bounties in colonial New England, bureaucratic hurdles and racist feuds discouraged Native Americans from claiming them. A wolf hunter had to present the head to a local official and swear that he had killed the animal within the town's boundaries. Then the official would have to vouch for the hunter, and the town treasurer would pay the bounty. Well, in peacetime, colonial governments used bounties to protect local economies and aid local industries. The wolf bounty functioned to safeguard livestock and knit local ecosystems into global capitalist markets. One historian writes, bounties on raw materials like hemp, flax, wool, and silk were designed to promote an abundant production and encourage colonial manufacture of rope and linen. In 1722, the Massachusetts government enacted a bounty for linen and duck, which is a rougher, heavier kind of linen, made in the colony, paying out nearly £135 in 1725 for 19 pieces of linen and for 38 pieces of duck, up from £43 the previous year. So proponents of paper money in New England and the Middle Colonies argued that public spending in peacetime, whether on hemp subsidies, construction projects, or manufactories, would not only increase liquidity, making it easier for colonists to sell produce, pay taxes, and settle debts, but also to encourage colonial settlement, facilitate wage payments, increase consumer demand, and stabilize prices. Perhaps the money's value was to be found in its productive capacity as much as in its destructive one. Yet in South Carolina, where overproduction, rather than growing marginal productivity, was the main affliction, one paper money advocate called on the colonial government to purchase rice from planters, creating an escape valve for the economy in case of sluggish markets at home or abroad. As a critic of the proposal pointed out, this was about letting planters produce without regard to the limit of the market by creating fictitious demand. Left unmentioned were the physical and psychological limits of the enslaved laborers who actually grew the rice. So while my talk today was focused mainly on how local governments send bills of credit into existence, it's okay, that's my baby, everyone. They also made money by lending it at interest to colonial settlers against land or human property. Now, in doing so, they increased their ability to respond to money scarcity independent of public spending levels. So if one of the ways early Americans made money was by making direct claims on the colonial state, another way they participated directly in creating the money they circulated was by taking out loans. But although anyone could use the money once it was in circulation, by restricting the loans to mostly property white men, colonial governments prioritized modes of production based on private property ownership and the commodification of land, and invested the public in the profits of racial chattel slavery, in the end creating new forms of hierarchy and dependency. And that is a talk for another day. So was early American money a democratic or proto-democratic medium? Historians have emphasized that bills of credit were issued by elected legislative assemblies, that those assemblies were subject to pressure from their constituents for additions to the currency, and that they wielded the power of the purse to get royal governors to go along with them. The imperial crisis leading to the American Revolution was triggered in part by British restrictions on local paper currencies. And the American Counter-Revolution, the US Constitution, banned state currency because it was too democratic, paving the way for the privatization of money creation. Today, economic orthodoxy obscures a history where democratic control over the creation of money was possible. Well, what lessons does that history offer us for the future? To quote 30 Rock, if there were money in the future instead of just hubs. Surely it's not just about democratizing money, but about challenging its meaning under capitalism as neutral or natural, and recovering its public and social aspects from market dominance. In a post-capitalist and post-colonial political economy, money would be created for the public good, based on social justice and sustainability, and spent on that first. Thank you. Thank you, Florence.
No, 3.0. 15.0.
Thanks so much, Katie, for that great paper. I've always wanted to know more about the wolf bounty, so I feel a sense of relief. And I have many questions, but we'll ask them later. Our next panelist is Sofia Valeonti. She has a PhD in economics from Sorbonne. She's currently an assistant professor of economics and management at the American University of Paris. She's a historian of economics and has published a number of articles on the 19th century US. Her research focuses especially on the interplay between economic theory, policy, and visions of economic development.
Hi, thank you for being here, the very last session almost. You can hear me? Can you hear me now? Thank you to the organizers, to David, for putting the panel together, and thank you for being here in one of the very last sessions. So this paper is co-authored with Ariel, who cannot be here with us today. He's a historian. And we, as we're doing here in this conference, we have found that it was very fruitful to discuss about money from a different disciplinary perspectives. So we have spent 2 days and a half talking about money as a democratic medium. But what does really makes money democratic? And when we tried to write this paper, we thought as of a monetary system can be democratic if, first, it is subject to democratic control, and second, it serves the needs of interests of the societies abroad. For a government to be democratic, what we need is that the government shall be able to control or at least regulate the monetary system. And for B, what we need is that the monetary authority will be able to harness and reallocate resources and to facilitate the creation of wealth among the population at large. 19th century US was lacking both conditions. How could a country without even a central bank accomplish something looking like a democratic money creation? So a little bit of context here, maybe many of you know that the US was lacking a central bank because in 1832 Andrew Jackson vetted the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States, which expired in 1836. 10 years later, the independent Treasury system was created, and its aim was to fully dissociate the fiscal policy from private banking and oblige the government to receive and pay and make payments exclusively on specie. And this strict separation of public finance and private banking reduced the federal responsibility for citizen welfare to an absolute minimum, at least at the federal level, as Robin Einhorn has already saw. So without even the ability to sustain a sufficient and stable currency, how was the state to make the monetary system serve democratic ends? And to answer that question, we examined the political economy of Stephen Colwell. Caldwell is not much studied or very well known today, but he was very influential in his own time. And what Caldwell proposed was his own solution. And his solution was that the United States should issue Treasury printed paper money on the basis of future revenues from taxation and combine that to a national clearinghouse. That was before the US Civil War, right? So it was really innovative. So what problem was he really trying to solve? Saying that first he realized, he put forth, everyone knew that the monetization of the US economy was insufficient. In the pre-Civil War United States, there was a scarcity and a multitude of paper money. Some banknotes were circulated with a premium. Banks failed to maintain convertibility, and there were recurrent financial crises. And the second point was that the United States had no central bank, and also they didn't even have a place where they could store their revenues from taxation, because what they used to do was to use the vaults of banks to store their revenues. Now that they dissociated themselves from the banks, they didn't have anywhere to place their revenue. So that's why it was called the independent treasury, because it was independent from banks. And that was Caldwell's problem. For him, the independent treasury, by being obsessed with convertibility, was not only independent from banks, but also from the economy, from the commercial activity. By that he meant that the independent treasury and the whole banking system and monetary system didn't allow to trade and commercial activities to harness the benefits of the banking system. That is, it didn't have sufficient means of payments and credit when there was a need for them. And Caldwell's primary interest was not money, it was trade and commerce and creation of wealth. And in a pre-Civil War context where good quality paper money was lacking, it was really important to create a money that actually works so that wealth can be created. So a little bit about the theory that Caldwell developed to back up his policy suggestions. He highlighted how the independent treasury adherence to specie convertibility was both useless and hurtful. Why did he say that it was useless? It's because he thought that tying paper money to gold didn't give it any value. We all know today that the dollars we have in our pockets, they're not related to gold or anything else, but still they have value. But saying that in the middle of the 19th century was innovative. Moreover, and more importantly, Caldwell highlighted that it was hurtful to commercial transactions, hence economic development. Why? For two reasons. First, in case of bank runs, which could appear due to real or psychological reasons, the banks were obliged to curtail credit when it was needed the most. During a crisis, the commercial interests, they needed credit in order to avoid bankruptcy. But this type of policy was impossible under a convertibility. The result was an increase in interest rate and an increase in prices, which destroyed commerce and trade. But convertibility was also hurtful for a second reason. It deprived the commercial interest from a banking system that could supply them with the so much needed means of payments and credit. Why? Actually, because the people opposing the banks and the banking system were afraid of depreciation and inflation. And Caldwell here, he developed a theory to explain that as long as paper money is demanded, it will not depreciate. And it will be demanded if it's based on real economic transactions. So as long as fiat money is based on promissory notes, for example, then that will not create inflation. So we shouldn't be worried of fiat money under standard conditions. So then Caldwell asked himself, if convertibility is both useless and harmful, why is independent treasury so obsessed with it? And why shouldn't we abandon the independent treasury system? Our interpretation is that Cowell's opposition to the need for convertibility actually led him to think that the real solution to the problem was the creation of a central bank, but that was not politically sustainable in the 1850s. So he couldn't say that, but it's very clear in his reading. So he had to find a second best solution. And the second best solution had two angles. The first one was to propose a treasury printed paper money on the revenues, on the future revenues of the government from taxation. For Caldwell, such a system would be both beneficial to the government, as it will increase its revenue. Very simply, it was easier for citizens to pay their taxes if they had enough money to do it. And it will also be beneficial to the economy, as it will increase the necessary means of payments for transactions. However, that didn't mean that the Treasury could issue as much money as they wanted, otherwise we would have inflation. He said that the Treasury shouldn't issue more notes than those that will reflux to the Treasury for the payment of taxes. And here you can see how actually he applies his idea of demand of money to justify that fiat money will not lose its value. Okay, so the second angle of his policy proposal was to combine this treasury money policy to the creation of a national clearinghouse. Actually, clearinghouse already existed. His idea was to make them, to have more branches of them. And our interpretation is that came in to fill the gaps of the independent treasury system and to offer the facilities of a central bank without it being a central bank, because politically that was not possible. So this national clearinghouse would do three things. First, they would create institution of domestic exchanges that would have branches in every state that the government could use to distribute all public revenues. Again, under the independent treasury system, they didn't have where to stock money, so that would be an easy way to solve this problem. The second aspect is that those national clearinghouses, the different branches, could accept treasury notes at parity, hence enhancing their demand. And the third is that they will coordinate exchanges between different regions. You can see now how this institution actually combined with the issuance of government paper money would be a second best solution to the absence of a central bank in the 1850s. You can also see how this plan really sounds like the Fed. And actually, it was remarked by the Journal of American Bankers Association in 1915 that the whole plan of the Fed is already in Howell. And to conclude, we think that Howell's plan aimed to make money more democratic. It charged the federal government with providing a uniform, stable, and sufficient currency. And it allowed the federal government to collect taxation in its own money while establishing domestic exchange institutions throughout the country. And the benefits of this plan were that it aimed to promote wealth creation by encouraging commercial activity. And it expanded the federal government's capability and capacity to raise revenue and potentially to deploy fiscal policy for the common good. I hope I had convinced you that that aimed to make money more democratic. And thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Sofia. That was a really fascinating paper on, I think, someone who's really over, and who certainly I did not know anything about before this talk. Thank you. So chronologically, we're moving forward from the 18th century to now the antebellum era, and now we're moving to around the time of the founding of the establishment of the Fed. I'm introducing now our third panelist, whose name is David Freund. And many of you know him as a historian, a political and policy historian, an author of a prize-winning book that's entitled Colored Property, State Policy and White Racial Politics in Suburban America. He's currently completing a manuscript for another book entitled State Money, Financial Policy and Market Mythologies in American History.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Hi. Thank you. Hello. Good time to call you. Okay. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. And I just want to say it's really nice to be back here. What, 5 years later, right? Jakob and I were on one of the few history panels at the last, at the original Money is Democratic meeting with Nathan. So it's really lovely to be back, to see a lot of people, and to meet some people who I've known on the internet now for a few years. Really love to see in person. So I've long been interested in powerful, I guess what we call hegemonic economic models and political narratives. The ones that distort Americans' understanding of how markets are made and why those markets routinely privilege some at the expense of others. So as Jakob mentioned, this story started years ago when I was writing Colored Property, and that work led me to the subject of money's credit functions and its legal identity. So I became a student of post-Keynesian economics, neoliberalism, legal history of finance, economic sociology, and together these fields helped me navigate what I see, and I think a lot of us see, as a kind of fundamental disconnect in contemporary discussions about finance. So on the one hand, we know that money is not the commodity-like token described in standard economics texts. It's not that token that simply stands in for valuable things that once long ago were exchanged via barter. Rather, we know that money is issued as a credit instrument and that its value is rooted in the issuer's promise to take back in payment, i.e. by its receivability. And for this reason, select state-issued monetary instruments, including the US dollar, command unique powers to shape economic growth, right? These money issuers create their currency and so have the ultimate authority to stand behind its promised value. Again, money is credit and a creature of the state. Still, and here's the disconnect, we also know that most intellectual and political standard bearers have long doubled down on orthodox mythologies and insisted that money obeys, or that it should obey, supposedly immutable and self-equilibrating market principles. So put simply, the disconnect is this: that standard macro analysis generally relies upon a story about money for which there is no supporting qualitative evidence. Or at best, it argues that money's real-world history has little relevance for understanding the principle of economics. So the question that interests me most is this: what explains this enduring attachment to a story about money that is not true? And I look for an answer in this larger project in the battles over money's definition, which, as Jeffrey Ingham writes, those battles have long proven, quote, integral to the struggle over money's production and control. So we know that money is a product of legal and political contestation, and in the process, that a recognition of its real-world functions, I'm sort of invoking Davidson there, has long been obscured, indeed actively silenced, by elites who benefit from these distortions. So the erasure both of money's credit identity and of currency issuers' wealth-making power, I'm arguing, has been instrumental to the work of controlling money's design and legitimizing the dominant monetary order. And essential to this process, we've seen for centuries, has been the reassertion of an illusory distinction between money and credit. What I'm looking at here is an important episode, which in that long-standing kind of reassertion. This is in the United States in the first half of the 20th century, when the consensus view about what counts as money changed decisively. So when the US entered World War I, most prominent writers, experts disagreed. There was plenty of disagreement among experts about money's nature, and closely related, literally about which financial instruments deserved the moniker. A narrow, so-called real bills view limited the category of money to coin and specie, and distinguished both of them from banknotes and bank-issued deposits. The latter two were different, supposedly, part of a credit-like category that was often called near monies. Meanwhile, a competing, so-called, what we often refer to as quantity school consensus, was broadening the definition of money during these years to include banknotes and, tentatively, checking deposits. and sharply distinguishing both of them from all other things that were supposedly credit instruments. Now jump ahead to mid-century, and the broader classification had prevailed. Banknotes and deposits were money, and credit instruments were different. This view, captured in the category of M1, sets the standard to this day. So what I'm arguing here is that this new consensus was in part a response to a development that proved inconvenient to monetary orthodoxy. Namely that during and after World War I, the Fed grew increasingly reliant upon a market for Treasury debt. And this shift highlighted the fact, for those who were paying attention, that Treasuries, government-issued debt, shared much in common with the US dollar, the government-issued currency. And a number of vested interests responded by insisting upon a sharp categorical distinction between them, that is, between money and credit. And this move, I think, proved instrumental to masking, again, both money's credit and state identities. So here's just a brief recap of part of the story that I'm trying to tell. To sort of make this point about that transformation in consensus clear, at least. There are a lot of moving parts that I can't talk about, but hopefully this will capture that. In 1913, we know that Congress established a new paper currency, printed by the US Treasury and managed by the 12 regional branches of the new Federal Reserve System. The branches introduced so-called Federal Reserve notes, or their accounting equivalent, into the nation's financial system via chartered banking institutions. And by design, very self-consciously, and for those who were here for Anur's talk, he actually brought this up in the last panel, they issued that money on so-called real bills principles. The reserves held by those chartered banks were collateralized either by specie or commercial paper, which is basically an IOU, and then banks could secure emergency loans if necessary to meet short-term liquidity needs by discounting, again, collateralizing, commercial assets, more commercial paper. So the intent of this design was to de-link the nation's monetary base from the issuance of treasury debt. It's very self-conscious. And that had been established by the National Banking Act in 1865, and that arrangement had for decades restricted the currency's elasticity, and as a result helped trigger a number of crippling financial crises. So again, the Fed's founders sought to remove treasuries from the politics of monetary management. That's the original vision. Again, by tying adjustments of the monetary base to private sector demand, more narrowly to the prospect of commercial activity, and overall anchoring the dollar's value solely in precious metals and commercial assets. But this proved to be an unsustainable model. And the Fed quickly returned to issuing base money against US government debt. This began in 1917, when Congress suspended the Act's real bill requirements and permitted the Fed and the Treasury to coordinate war finance. Much of the famous Liberty and later Victory Bond debt was purchased on margin. This disappears in most economic histories of the war. It's really fascinating. Basically, new treasuries were accepted as collateral for the private bank loans used to buy the very same debt. And it was by this means that the US government quickly assumed its largest debt to date, basically via a financing strategy that was pretty much indistinguishable from the fiat greenback issues that had paid for the Union's effort in the Civil War. Then, instead of retiring its Liberty bond obligations after the war, which it promised to do, so that was the only financially responsible thing to do, after the war, the Treasury refinanced them. And meanwhile, the Fed's regional branches altered their practices for advancing new reserves, relying less on discounting commercial assets and more on this little thing that was written into the Fed that wasn't intended for these purposes, which was called open market operations, which were intended to just help local branches actually generate profits. So essentially, they turned more and more to the purchase and sale of existing US Treasuries and other government guaranteed instruments. If that sounds familiar, that's because how the Fed, what the Fed relies on primarily now, well, depending on the moment, for its policy. Those developments set the stage for a number of Depression-era emergency measures that completed this repurposing of government debt. So between 1932 and 1935, a bunch of legislative and executive actions enhanced the Fed's power, centralized its decision-making in Washington, D.C., It cemented the Treasury bond's role in monetary management, and it nullified famously the domestic gold standard. So now the domestic dollar was no longer backed by specie, nor, quite often, even tied to commercial debts, since treasuries were now deemed virtually indistinguishable from commercial paper for central bank operations. So this is the real bills doctrine, right? This is what a lot of intellectual historians call the common sense rules. They're not very clearly defined, but sort of common sense thinking among bankers and people in finance in the 19th century. Real bills doctrine that had long guided the financial community and that were literally written into the Federal Reserve Act appeared to be obsolete. Meanwhile, economists, politicians, and pundits reconciled these some core orthodox ideas with this new financial status quo by recasting U.S. Treasury securities as uniquely safe and liquid financial instruments. Again, prior to World War I, the federal debt was quite small, certainly by 20th century standards, and investors, with the exception of the owners of chartered national banks, showed little to no interest in buying U.S. Treasuries. And it's really telling that there's a manual for securities traders, published by Chamberlain, as first name, in 1912, reminded readers that unless they were in the banking business, he said, quote, "Nothing but unfamiliarity with investment principles is an excuse for private buying of United States bonds." And that the Treasury, I love this, quote, "did not seek or want the money of investors." This was the conventional wisdom. And this conventional wisdom proved to be very stubborn, despite the post-war growth of those open market operations. As late as 1927, W. Randolph Burgess of the Fed published a very influential study, The Reserve Banks and the Money Market, in which he insisted that commercial debt remained the standard for Fed operations, that it was the key to guaranteeing, quote, "the safety and liquidity of Fed advances." And quote, he said that guaranteeing the safety and liquidity of Fed advances, necessary to do that, was the character of the collateral which banks are required to furnish as security. This was still conventional wisdom. So what I try to detail in the longer version of this piece in this book is how a global financial crisis and a wave of emergency legislation effectively dislodged real bills thinking and fashioned this new consensus. And again, it's a lot of moving parts, pretty complicated set of actors, but I just want to sort of capture the broad outlines of it. Beginning in 1933, real bills advocates sounded the alarm over all these Depression-era proposals to restructure the Fed. They did congressional hearings in the mainstream and financial press, and in direct appeals to legislatures. I'll just sample one. This was a letter from Bernard Baruch, who is a financier and a Roosevelt confidant, writing Congressman Carter Glass, and who was one of the designers of the original Fed and a critic of these new reforms, although he eventually signed off on them. He wrote to Glass saying, quote, "Issuing credit against things which are not liquid," in other words, by which he meant treasuries, quote, "could only result in an expansion of credit for stock gambling purposes and destroy the Fed." This was the view of this, what I'm calling these roughly the real bills critics. So what happens in the 30s, going on before, and it sort of accelerates afterwards, but basically reformers defenders countered those arguments that these changes would, and argued that these changes would not distort sort of a free market for finance. And essential to their argument was reversing the conventional wisdom about the investment quality of government bonds. So the most prominent and arguably influential defense came from an economist and New Deal advisor, Lachlan Curry, who in 1934 published a very famous work, was his dissertation from 1932. It was published in 1934 as The Supply and Control of Money in the United States. And it urged legislators to liberalize the Fed's collateral. What's really noteworthy about reading Curry is that he devoted a lot of real estate in this book to what he called the important distinction between money and credit. First time I read it, I thought, why are you going off on this in such detail? And it was it's a really confusing discussion as well. Here's what he writes. Money is, quote, "a means of payment used to complete purchases in the present." What counted as money in Curry's view? Specie, coins, bank paper, and demand deposits. The category is notably expanded here. Credit, he says, is something different. He calls it, quote, an equivalent to means of payment, end quote, that represents a promise to complete a purchase in the future with money, right? And this category included savings accounts, an array of debt instruments, promissory notes, private securities, and, importantly, US government bonds. So what I'm marking here is that reasserting this distinction was really vital to Curry and a lot of like-minded thinkers at the time for a practical reason. The nation's changing financial landscape threatened to undermine orthodoxy's imagined definition of money as a commodity-like token. Real-world developments were exposing the much messier truth, that instruments named money by orthodoxy shared essential characteristics with instruments that it called credit. That's the problem. And influential real bills advocates were highlighting this in political circles. They were highlighting this slippage when they distinguished specie and coin, what they call true money, from reserves, bank paper, and bank deposits. I'm sorry, yes. So generations of orthodoxy's defenders had countered similar challenges by simply reasserting money's commodity-like character. This battle had been going on literally for hundreds of years. They did it by naming money as a thing and saying credit was a promise of a thing. But changes in American finance had undermined this defense by the early 20th century, because by then checking deposits, which had once been deemed credit forms by most economists, were the fastest growing component of the circulating money supply. This happened over the course of the late 19th century. And as Treasury debt, as we see, was once again treated as exchangeable for money. So its newfound liquidity, ensured by the growth of this robust secondary market, made it both a safe store of monetary value for bankers, and there was precedent for this, but also an attractive investment to non-bank investors. And so Curry resolved any ambiguities by both reasserting and redrawing the line between money and credit. By firmly situating both cash and checking deposits in the category of true money, and again, even Irving Fisher had been reluctant to do this, it's really interesting. Curry took it a step further, and by doing this, he distinguished both from credit instruments, and by doing that, he distinguished them categorically from treasury debt. So he reaffirmed money's imagined identity as a commodity-like thing, created by banks to satisfy market needs, while locating treasuries among the debt instruments, the so-called near monies or money equivalents, that were supposedly created just to save, borrow, or invest in existing wealth. And by this logic, Curry and like-minded thinkers refuted the real bill's argument that advancing new money, that is reserves, against treasury debt would devalue the currency. That was impossible if money and treasuries performed different functions. In this telling, the US government issued debt to make up for revenue shortfalls, and then the Fed monetized some of that debt, when necessary, to manage the supply of money narrowly defined. So treasuries, they insisted, just so happened to provide a useful tool for achieving these monetary policy goals. And it also meant that Fed operations had no direct influence upon the origination of government bonds, which is really interesting when you think about open market operations as they developed in the 20th century. The Fed's heavy reliance upon treasury debt instruments for the purposes of monetary management was thus distanced from the debt's origination. So the timing of this battle, I think, is really telling. Just as work on money's credit and state identities was again challenging the commodity exchange tradition, there was a robust expansion of work in what is now called chartless and neo-chartless explorations of this. Just at that moment, Curry refuted scientifically with the new post-marginal revolution economic science, the view that newly issued money was a credit instrument. And by doing so, reaffirmed the myth that managing the nation's money supply was at best a technocratic matter, right? Treasuries were valuable, he explained, but shared no essential characteristics with the government-issued currency. Notably, Curry also helped write these views into law and financial practice. He advised Utah banker Mariner Eccles in 1934 during the latter's negotiations with Roosevelt over assuming the helm at the Federal Reserve. Curry and Eccles together, this is really Curry's proposal that Eccles then advanced to Roosevelt, recommended a permanent expansion of the types of paper eligible for rediscount, basically redefining the assets deemed sound for expanding the monetary base. Roosevelt was persuaded, Eccles accepted the position, and then Curry then turned to drafting, was brought in with him and turned to drafting the Banking Act of 1935, which was the culmination of this radical set of reforms, codifying the changes of the previous 2 decades, and giving the Federal Reserve Board, rather than regional branches, primary responsibility for open market operations. That is, for the main tool employed to create and destroy system reserves. Curry then actually consulted in detail with the Fed's General Counsel, Walter Wyatt, to defend the bill against congressional critics. So he was literally there on the ground helping turn this into policy. Soon, textbooks began to teach the new consensus. In 1937, revisions to Burgess's reserve banks and the money market described treasuries as often, quote, safer and more liquid than even the best quality commercial paper. So that's a quick change. Why the change? Yeah, he knew people were going to be freaked out by this, so he actually says, this might seem strange to you, and he explains why. He says, recent experience had forced the Fed to question real bills principles when they discovered that the key to protecting money's value and elasticity was not, quote, the specific type of collateral held, but rather the mechanism by which notes are issued. Soon thereafter, the real bills generation would be sidelined and its theory of banking rejected by most academic economists. By 1951, E.A. Goldenweiser's textbook, American Monetary Policy, noted that, quote, eligibility, that is, restricting lending to good commercial paper, as a protection against overexpansion of credit, had long since been abandoned, and so too had the distinction between notes and deposits. They're aware of this happening, and they're trying to logic it out. Strictly, he explained, central banking operations deal with quantity rather than with quality of credit. Now, by 1963, Freund and Schwartz blithely dismissed the Fed's early leadership for their, quote, qualitative real bills point of view and for making invalid distinctions between discounts, bills, and government securities. Now the authors explain economists knew better. And by then, just to wrap this up, American political leadership had been repeating the story for decades. Indeed, since that New Deal reform had remade the financial landscape. From the first days of the Roosevelt administration, the public had been encouraged to reimagine Treasury debt as a uniquely safe liquid investment. Political leaders joined economists in attributing the Depression's endurance to a liquidity crisis prolonged by a collapse of confidence. And by doing so, they reaffirmed orthodox assumptions about liquidity and about money. They revised the working definition of sound assets for backing the monetary base by describing U.S. Treasuries as a particularly liquid financial instrument. Most accounts of early 20th century financial history repeat the story to this day, and they portray the ascendance of this updated orthodox consensus as a triumph of economic science, not as a product of politics and reform itself. But what I'm arguing here is that orthodoxy's triumph was in no small part secured through one of many battles over the control and definition of money. And that the orthodox tradition confirmed a story that many people wanted to hear. At the time and in post-war America, a lot of Americans were anxious to reconcile the government's expansive role in the economy with their belief in the sanctity of free markets. And so a range of heterodox critics, were calling attention to the limits of that model. Embracing it continued to mask the powers of the currency issuing government. So to conclude, my last statement. And to situate this smaller case study in what I think is a larger history. Orthodoxy's resilience in the face of a generations-old heterodox critique has long depended on this insistence on the sharp division between money and credit. And this mythology has performed important political work by imagining currency issuers as market bystanders and the process of wealth creation as analytically separable from the exercise of the state's monetary authority. Insistence that money is just a special kind of commodity, that's the language still used in most textbooks, has successfully obscured how monetary issue, right, the design and creation of money, structures marketplaces and social systems of production, and critically, the remarkable power of the currency issuer to shape those processes. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much to all three of you. Those were excellent papers, and I really learned a lot from them. About the political practice of colonial treasury money, Kohl's critique of that hardcore Jacksonian institution that was the independent treasury system, and also about definitions of money that sort of enable the survival of commodity theory in a post-real bills world? I have detailed, historical questions, but I kind of want to start us off with an overarching question, and that would be, how do those historical monetary practices and knowledges that you talk about help us look at our own time in new ways? If our role as intellectuals, as Eileen Grable said, quoting Hirschman, is to identify possibilities, how do they help us look at the present and at the future differently? If money could become a democratic medium, how does your work enable us to think about that differently? So maybe any of you can jump in, or we can go chronologically. No, you don't want to go chronologically.
Let's go first. So,
Hear me already come back next. The way I thought about it, we thought about it with Ariel, was that it actually fits in very well for us with this Colwell story, and his policy suggestions fit very well with this new literature about the role of the state in the United States. So I'm thinking here, William Noddock's work, he kind of shows us that there was a state in the 19th century US. And I think that this type of thinking that Colwell develops shows us how political economists thought about the role of the state in promoting economic development in the 19th century US in a very practical way, and how we can associate private and public interests in a way to promote economic development. And I think that this is important today because by studying how we arrived where we are, how we build it, the development and the growth we have can allow us to think about the future and all the issues we have with all the financing and also of adaptation and mitigation policies. It's far, but I think it could be inspiring.
Great, thank you. Maybe a really quick follow-up question. So when you're talking about economic development, right? For me, that is one side of the coin, and I think I'm wondering how you think about the relation between economic development and democracy, right? Because the two can be linked, but they don't have to be linked, right? But that's maybe for later. Does anyone want to comment?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I don't know if this necessarily answers your question, but it's kind of a fun story. When I first started reading, the heterodox economics literature, I had already been working on my project for some time. And the first time I read Randy Ray's book, Understanding Modern Money, I was struck by how much it sounded like Cotton Mather writing in 1691. And so I think more than anything else that tells us that there is a history to this sort of modern money movement, and we need to understand the history, but it's not necessarily a democratic history. And so I think part of the challenge is recovering money from its colonial and settler colonial and racial capitalist roots, while at the same time trying to forge a path forward. And I don't know what that path forward necessarily is. But there are a lot of connections between what's being written now about state money and state money as it was actually issued in the 18th century. But back then, what it was harnessed for were, wars of conquest and colonialism and enslavement. Today we can harness it for so much more, obviously, but the courage and political will has to be there.
Great, thanks so much. Dave, you want to jump in?
I became a historian of money by accident when I was writing Public Property. The book was about, I was trying to understand why white people in the modern United States in the post-war suburb were oblivious to the fact that their good fortune was a product of heavy government involvement and subsidy. So that then made me a student of mortgage markets, and when I was studying those mortgage markets, it struck me that what the government was doing was creating an instrument that created wealth. But none of the economists seemed to agree with that, nor did contemporaries. That's really curious. And so as I was finishing that book, I stumbled upon a post-Keynesian history of this, and then I just took a deep dive. And what I learned in doing the study of housing is kind of its version of what I'm exploring here, is that the folks who were in charge of reinventing that market were really deeply invested in the story that what they were doing was not wealth creating, that insuring a loan was not wealth creating. And I realized that reflected orthodox thinking about this kind of, again, supposed divide between the financial sector and the real. So that's what sort of clued me onto this, was the fact that it had such kind of incredible political traction. So I think the short answer to your question is, how is it relevant for today? You know, these traditions of work on money and credit show us that the lines between public power and so-called private market actions are fuzzy at best. Yet we live in a political culture and an academic culture too that's really deeply invested in the idea that these things are separable. So I think it's really important to educate people about that fuzziness in order to stop the kind of opposition you get to certain kinds of fiscal and monetary proposals. That opposition is, well, we don't want the government involved in the private market. And to which I always say, show me the private market. I haven't seen it yet.
Well, let me go and find it. So maybe let's open. Let's take a few questions from the audience, if there are any.
Thanks for this panel. As you can imagine, I found every paper fascinating. David, I have a question for you in particular this time, because I'm fascinated by the conversion of bank notes and deposits into money and the relationship of that conversion into capital. Because one of the things I'm interested in is how we define capital. And I wonder if in your travels in this drama, you see them coming to the conclusion that if there's lots of bank money, what I think happens in the end of the 19th century is lots of bank money, we no longer think of that as credit, as created, we actually can think of that as capital, and therefore capital as existing in pools, which pre-exist the use then of, which pre-exist and are necessary for more production. A whole different vision of how the market comes about rather than through credit and advances.
I'll do a very quick.
Microphone?
Oh, sorry, thank you. That's really big. Thank you for the question. And I'm not going to try to answer it in any kind of comprehensive way. What I found, yes, there's a change, and I'm still sifting through this, the changing discourses in this literature. I've been reading basically books on money and banking and political speech on it from the mid to late 19th century up to the 1950s, and it's an absolute mess. There's so much inconsistency. So I'm not going to say anything definitive and answer that, but I will say that one of the things that struck me is the endurance of the argument that what was actually money, what actual money stood in for capital. So for example, it's really fascinating, both the real bills and early currency people had that same model. There's still very much a kind of commodity money theory undergirding even real bills thinking. But it's in this time, and I'm trying to figure out how it diverges, and I haven't yet. But it's in this time that what Curry does is just expands the category of money. He still sees it the same way. They're both arguing that that what's actually money is a representative of that actual capital that's out there. And again, I see them sort of trying to adapt to a reality that doesn't meet their model. And so far, I've been able to carve out the story that's captured in Curry's work and then in the post-war work, where they solve that puzzle by literally just redefining the instruments. That's all I can get for now. It's just this literature is absolutely driving me insane. Because they're trying to describe something that doesn't exist, and then I'm trying to map out a transformation of a creation of a new logic that's illogical to replace an old logic that's kind of illogical. And everyone's inconsistent. They'll make these categorical statements at the beginning of their text on money and banking, and then the book is just filled with, oh, but maybe, not. So that's it right now. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I think there was a question over there. Yeah.
Hi, so I have a comment for David and a bibliographical reference that probably everybody knows, but just in case you don't, and then a question for Sofia. My comment is that I know that in the 1910s, Irving Fisher is writing to whoever he can, and he has a lot of correspondence, of course, saying, how are workers paid in your town? Are they paid with checks or cash? I need to know this so that I know what the money supply is. But what's really interesting is I've also looked at some correspondence from, I can't remember it's a trade organization of manufacturers, and they're talking about, are we gonna pay in cash or check? And some huge number of them say, well, it would be more secure if we paid by check, because then we wouldn't have to worry about being held up when we go to get the payroll, which happens all the time because it's the 1920s. But we can't, because our workers don't have checking accounts, because our workers are immigrants and they're illiterate. And so it's interesting to think that just at the moment when checking accounts are being defined as money, some people don't have access, quite a few people don't have access to that. So the bibliographical reference, and I'm sure you know it, but again, maybe somebody else missed it. Bernard Harcourt, Harcourt, the book The Illusion of Free Markets. That's a really good book to look at to give you a sense that, has there ever been a market that existed independent of some sort of public involvement? And then my question for Sofia was, I am by no means a historian of 19th century US, but I was fascinated by Colwell saying, so only issue as much as you expect you're going to get back in taxes. So of course, there's no national income tax, right? Is he thinking excise? Is he thinking state taxes? How is he going to know how much you might get back in taxes?
Yes. And I'll talk to you, the dynamics of that are really interesting to me, and I'll be happy to talk about it.
So you're absolutely right. The federal level of taxation is relatively low, and what is paid is taxation in gold. So his idea was that as the treasurer, the secretary of the treasury, you should calibrate. So you should make tests. In the beginning, you start taxing. You issue money, and then you expect a certain amount of revenues, and then you try to calibrate. So you try, and actually it's very interesting because that is published in 1859. 1861, there's a discussion about the greenbacks, and in Spalding, who is the one who proposes the Greenback Law Act, and in the history of the legal tender, there's a letter by Colwell saying to Spalding what he's supposed to do, and that's actually, so how do you know how many greenbacks you should print? You should calibrate them with the level of the revenue from the first income taxation, and that's how we got actually interested in Colwell, from those letters.
Great, thanks. I think there's a question all the way in the back.
Hi, these are fabulous papers, and I also have a question for Sofia, kind of about taxation. And I'm a historian of the same period, and when I was listening to your presentation, my question is basically like, what's this guy's deal? Like, what is he hoping is gonna happen? It sounds really suspicious. And that's because he's writing in 1859, so slavery is like on the forefront of everybody's minds. And there had been equalized domestic exchanges, right? A paper currency that was circulated at par across the country. And in this period, the people who benefited from that the most are the people who want to do business between the upper South and the lower South, so slave traders, or northern manufacturers who want to sell to slave plantations, manufactured goods. So this sort of seems like something that would really benefit slave owners and the slave economy. But he also is thinking about raising taxes, which is the thing that made slave owners so angry that they would try to nullify laws in South Carolina, tried to leave the Union over it. So I assume that he's not pro-slavery. So what's he think gonna happen to this bifurcated domestic economy that's half free and half slave? What's his political vision here?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for your question. Your good point as always. He's a conservative. And he's, as you said, an auto manufacturer. He's in Philadelphia. He's actually an iron mill owner, so iron factory in century terms. And what he wants to do, he has the same vision of development, and he's very close to Henry Ariel. So his idea is, let the South go, and we need to find a way, we need to have a monetary system that works so that we can develop our domestic manufacture. He's certainly a conservative, though, in most literature, so he's not very progressive. So yeah, it is suspicious because he is defending the manufacturing interests of domestic development and development of industry.
Thanks. Excellent, thanks. Thank you. Thanks to everybody on the panel. This is for David. I think that you said that Curry is engaging with, you're saying it's a mess. So the two sides of the debate involve, mistaken views about what money is, and they're just driving the stakes in different directions. Was anyone advocating for a Nappian view or a Keynesian view? Was there anyone giving voice to the views that I think most of us in this room would find the correct views to endorse, or are they just completely off the map in the course of this discussion?
I think that I'm going to get Jakob to join in on the answer to this. Thank you. I was waiting for you. There's a lot of sort of Sorry.
I've been out of my house since 2019. I'm a little busy. There was a lot of what I think we would call proto-Nappian, sort of thinking in social movements, but in the kind of the formal expert literature. I mean, we know that Keynes read Napp and was really influenced by it, and then there was a kind of taste of this obviously in Keynes's work. That's about as close as it came to what we now is developed into a kind of a proper kind of constitutional / neo-Charlist view, whatever you want to call it. And I've been spending so much time on these kind of arcane texts that I have not been thinking as much about the popular articulations of this. So can I defer to you for thoughts on that?
Maybe really quickly. So I think in that period, many people think that the Fed shows up and populist chartism goes away, but I think it was very much alive, and you can see that because it returns to the Great Depression really quickly. So I think all the people who write, and that's what makes your work something that's bigger than just intellectual history of one or two people. I think they write with that in mind, right? They know that there are large numbers of people who basically think like volunteers, right? And I think you can only understand them if you situate them in that context.
So I think there was a movement. I mean, from the late 19th century, the battles over gold, up through and a lot of radical critics in 1930. From there to what's fascinating to me the most is real Bills folks, because they're really wedded to an old-fashioned idea, but they're too smart, and they realize that the credit issue is really, really important, and they're trying to reconcile the two. They don't quite get it right, but they are making enough noise that they're highlighting that disconnect. Thanks.
Thanks. In Jakob's book, he tells the story of FDR, who proclaims upon dropping the gold standard that this is not fiat money, nonetheless, this is backed by collateral. This is the legal tender of the United States. My question for David is, what is the nature of collateral when you're paper money is, when your reserves are redeemable for paper money that is itself legal tender of the payment of taxes?
Well, in reality or in the political imagination of people at the time?
Please go for it.
I mean, tax receivability is ultimately and I see someone who would like to comment on that, is ultimately the root of that, and sovereign power is the root of, and I'm thinking about Kate's paper, right? Go ahead.
I mean, I would also add that it also amounts to the productive capacity of the inhabitants, right? I mean, certainly many people would argue that. My 17th century and 18th century colonists were arguing that. In addition to it being tax receivability, it was the productive capacity of land.
Once it's issued, it takes on a very much more complicated life, but at the point of issue, it is really rooted in tax receivability. And I think one of the things that we're all studying and trying to sort through is how people at different moments in US history understood that, didn't understand that, and navigated it in part through these different narratives to explain that away and say it's ultimately just about the productive capacity and how people use that money, and then to actually disengage state power from the power of money. But there are a lot of people here who wanted that I'm thinking might comment on this as well.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to chime in on that real quick because I've been looking at that in the last month or so in more detail. And I mean, FDR is doing a kind of flim-flam thing with that. He's like, oh, it's backed by collateral, but he's not explaining what he means. What he means, so he's talking about the big, cash that's being driven out, right before the bank holidays are gonna end to all the banks. But it's not like they're just giving the banks cash, being like, it's great that you get cash, but technically they're getting discount window loans. So the collateral is the collateral that the banks are pledging to the Federal Reserve for the loans. But he, explaining that makes it seem a lot like, oh, so the mortgage is backing it, he didn't have Jimmy Stewart to go, your money is in that mortgage, and in his fund, and his that doesn't have that rhetorically to draw on. So he's keeping it ambiguous because that will look, 1933, it's like, oh, it's gonna be a farm mortgage and a dust bowl is what's backing this money. Well, that doesn't sound great. So yeah, it's a usual FDR, ambiguity, artful ambiguity, constructive ambiguity.
Thanks, Nathan. Oh, hi. I'm so excited about this panel. I have so many questions, but I'll just limit myself to one for David. Oh, no, so I have so many questions for Katie. I'm gonna monopolize her time for 2 hours after this. Well, okay, all right, I'll ask you, okay. So what was the role, so there was also this idea in some of the colonial legislatures that in addition to being paid back in as taxes, bills of credit had to be sunk, that they had to sort of develop a sinking fund. So I'm trying to figure out sort of what role did the sinking fund in some of these colonies actually play in the perception among the people who were using these bills of credit that they had value, that they could eventually sort of be sunk by the colony for sort of something else of value.
Well, so you've done a lot of work on Maryland, so I imagine you're referring to the Bank of England sinking fund. That was actually very unique. I think at least in the earlier period, they were the only colony that had something like that. And in the other colonies, what they referred to as the sinking fund, because they used the same phrase, was actually the tax. The tax was the sinking fund. The Maryland example was unique in that they invested a bunch of money in Bank of England stock. You probably know this better than me. But everywhere else, the sinking fund was the future tax.
So my great handicap in life is that I live 10 minutes away from the American Archives, so it just colors everything we get.
Great. I think this is actually a perfect time to wrap up, because we can finish on time. I think everyone is tired. Thank you so much for coming to this panel, and